I could have asked a dozen questions, 100 questions. Bob Campbell stood right in front of that little well house and just shook his head. There's nothing here, no track nor trace. I said, no, they took it all down. And that's when he had tears in his eyes. He said, a part of my life is just gone. He said, I can't believe that there isn't some kind of a memento here to let people know that we were here. When I'm not here, there's nobody else to tell the story.
Hitler was boasting in 1939 when the war started about a new technology which he felt was going to change the direction of the war. He begins mining the channel and the waters around the United Kingdom. The United States Navy actually sent a group of personnel over to investigate this mine. The devices he was using were magnetic mines, very much like the ones that were being tested in Selmah. My interest in military history stems from my family ties. I had a great-grandfather who is in the British Navy. I had a great-uncle who served in the British Army. And of course, my grandfather served in the Canadian Forces during World War II. It all comes from that family connection, but predominantly it's World War II and that era from 1939 to 1945 that captures my interest every time. About 11 years ago, my mom comes to me and tells me a story about an abandoned military base in Selmah, Nova Scotia, not far from where she grew up in Maitland, and that this base may have been an American military base at some point, possibly even the US Navy. So I knew the area, and it surprised me at first that there would be a secret military base in that particular part of Nova Scotia. So I looked into it a little bit. I found a few references to the base. There were some photos of concrete and maybe where foundations were and things like this. But there was definitely some talk on the internet about this base. But there wasn't a whole lot to tell a story about at that time. The other part of it was there was nothing that was remaining, which from a filming perspective makes it a little difficult to do a story on something. So I passed on the story at that time and didn't pay much attention to it. And then recently it came up again, talking about wedding anniversaries with my parents. Turns out they had their wedding reception at one of the buildings that was remaining on the secret military base. They cleaned it up, hooked up the power, and that's where they had the reception back in 1965. She mentions again, should do some type of story. And when I revisited the subject, there was basically nothing that identified the story or the base. There was no mention of it. So it caught me because I felt at that time, well, there you go, there's history disappearing. You know, history disappearing right before my own eyes in my time. And that made me dig in a little deeper. My mom's still very connected to the area. She put me in touch with Pat Whidden at the East Hants Historical Society. I spoke to her a little bit, back and forth via the internet, and essentially she confirmed that, you know, we know a little bit, we don't know everything, aware of the history, but certainly interested in helping us find more. And she put me in touch with Fred Anthony. And Fred, again, very interested in the history of the area, very interested in finding out more about the base. He connected me to Merrill Miller, telling me that, you know, Merrill used to work there. Well, that's interesting. Somebody used to work there, somebody has direct knowledge. And he's got some photos. So I'm thinking, okay, great, some photos. Is that, you know, 5 or 6 or whatever? I'd take anything because I could find nothing at this point. Turns out he had a whole lot more.
The contractors moved in, and it all happened just really fast, and they worked diligently there, and it was cold, frozen, big piles of frozen mud. But they built it in the wintertime. I don't know why. They just needed it, and they move ahead, build it. I suppose the reason I got the job there is that I was poking around and was always hanging around and in their way, and so they gave me a job to work in the kitchen.
What did you call yourself? What was your job title back
then? I guess in terminology it'd be cookie.
Yeah, yeah.
But it was mostly just, hey, you.
Yeah, can imagine.
Get a move on.
A bunch of young guys together, yeah. That's right. I'm hungry.
Merrill's an important person in this story. He is bright, articulate, inquisitive, and all of those things still in his 90s. And the fact that he's connected directly to the base, worked there, knew the people, Merrill knows the name of each and every individual, can tell you a little backstory about each of the people. And isn't that what it's all about? Adding that little bit of context to history, because these folks aren't around to be able to tell their story now.
You know, for years I've known about this story, and there's nothing on the internet about it of any great consequence. You really have to look hard to find anything, and when you find anything, it's very little.
Yeah.
None of it is photographic. And then I meet you, and you have everything that you could possibly want to prove that this base existed and what it did. And all of this is one gentleman visits you. We figured now about 13 or 14 years ago. Tell me about that gentleman.
Bob Campbell, he was the CO. I say CO, he's probably called something else. From about 6 or 8 months after they arrived there, the other guy was sent back and Bob Campbell took over.
You hadn't been in contact with him since the base closed, probably just before that. And all of a sudden this one day, somebody shows up.
So he flew up from the States, landed in Nova Scotia unannounced, and just took an ad hoc trip out to Maitland to possibly run into Merrill. And being a small town, he did run into Merrill. Basically asked the first person on the street, have you seen Merrill Miller? And that person said, yeah, Merrill's right over there.
And I glanced up, and the guy coming in, walking in my lane, and I had no idea who he was. No. And he looked at me and he said, are you Merrill? Yes. Oh my God. And he just shook his head. He looked at me and shook his head and do you know who I am? No, you look familiar, but I don't know who you are. Bob Campbell. He said, the Navy base. Bob Campbell from the Navy base? Yes. Well, we hugged each other and tears in our eyes, and he was so glad to see me as I was to him. It was just a shock to me, and I think a shock to him also. Last he remembered me as a little snotty-nosed kid about yay high. So we talked, and he only had a short time, and I wish he had have stayed longer because I would have quizzed him on many, many guys and many, many things.
He looked at Merrill and said, look, I've got a ton of photos that you should probably have because other than, you know, me, you're the only person that knows this place ever existed and what it was.
Thus, a lot of these little photos came about a month later in the mail. Big brown envelope.
He followed through and sent all these photos. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this record of photos that Merrill could show us. It's an incredible find of a place that you would probably not even know existed if you were standing on the site this day.
There was not much interaction between myself and the guys.
Okay.
I stayed in the kitchen and I had a room upstairs. I could go up there, but you didn't go in and talk. You didn't go in if you felt like it. But their talk was over my head all the time anyway, and I was just a nosy kid.
So how old were you at that time?
I'd be 14 then, I guess.
Yeah.
13 when I went there, and 14 in July, and so the next 3 years I was there with them.
Was it unusual in the community? It just strikes me as being something that would be almost shocking.
Yeah, when I think back of it, I said, ooh, people were really whispering, what's going on over there? It's the American Navy coming in here. Oh my Lord, what are they going to do to the place? Should we hide? There was a lot of apprehension of what might happen. We had no idea, and they didn't tell you. It was very secretive.
The very first memory you have of something happening at that base is what, when you think back on it?
The one thing that comes to mind is the guy that was drilling the well, Luther Spencer. He had an old one-lung engine and a belt and an old dilapidated pounder drill. And he was there for 3 months drilling a well for them. It was his last well he ever drilled.
Isn't it interesting that your very first memory of that place is the only thing that actually probably exists on the site?
I never thought of it. That's true. It's still there.
Yeah.
Well, he provided a good well.
Now, when they first arrived and started to scout the area in that summer period of 42, one of the locals in Maitland gave up their shed or their barn.
That was Albert Ammon,
Yeah.
and he's still in Maitland today. And they needed a place to store things because they were there before the sheds were all ready. So they stored the place there, and on the end of the door, they stamped NOL, and that's still there today. You can still see it.
Yeah.
Naval Ordnance Laboratory.
It's pretty important for people to know because that directly links that base to the American.
Yeah, yeah. It's just coincidental that they used it, but it's there, and they did.
Yeah.
And then as soon as they were ready, they moved everything out and took it down there.
When it was built, when the
When
base
they
was
were ready down there for this shop, yeah.
There's a great shot of American equipment being offloaded from a Canadian National rail car onto the ground in South Maitland. It's an interesting photo because it ties everything together. Must have been some of the very first photos taken because it seems to me like they're trying to tell a story. The garage or the shed that they're going to store all this equipment in while the base is being built. Vintage shots of what would be 1940s Maitland. It shows the unpaved streets and a lot of the same buildings existing in the exact same spots. And it also shows the old hotel where, some of the U.S. Navy military people and maybe even the specialists would have stayed at first while the base was getting ready.
When you start to sketch the base together, you've got the bunker up in the hill away from the main base. You've got that main building where the guys slept and ate and relaxed and where you did most of your work. Then there's the commander of the base. His quarters are across the street, and the cook, they also put him across the street separately. What other buildings are we talking about around that main building where you did your work? What other
There
buildings?
are 2 other big buildings, one of them almost equal in size. In fact, the other 2 are almost equal in size. One was their workshop,
Yeah.
the technical place.
Yeah.
The other place was where they fixed the machinery. A garage, in other words,
Right.
just to keep the trucks on the road.
How often were you in the place where they had the lab?
Oh, as often as I could get away and go in and poke around and looking at this and looking at that.
There's that great photo that's taken inside that lab area.
You can see a very blurry figure on the left who must have moved while the photo was being taken. But obviously he looks like he's working at a bench. You can see in the background, you can see the garage door. The photo's interesting to me because it really is the only photo that we have of the inside working area, the lab. He remembered being in that area. He remembered the workbench off to the left. He remembered everything as if he was that 14-year-old kid again. This is the only photo that I know of that exists that represents some of the work that went on in that, what would have been a really secretive area at that time frame.
They never told me anything, and I didn't ask.
No.
I wasn't really interested enough. I just was curious as I had a curious mind, and I watched them, and then they'd go into a room off to the side and do calculations in there, and they'd shut the door.
So I was curious about what they might be testing. And they look like bombs, or they look like torpedoes. So I sent those photos to a friend of mine, Chris Havern, who's a naval historian. And he sent it to a number of his associates, and everyone concluded that, by the looks of it, they were testing US Navy mine technology. Pat Whidden from the East Hants Historical Society sent me a newspaper article that was written, I would say, in the 1980s, roughly. And that piece was about the military base and its existence, and how there was still some remnants of that base around, mostly ordnance that had been discovered, and things that had been discovered that had been dropped into the Cobequid Bay. At the very end, as sort of like a last line, made reference in that article to the fact that even though the base was located by the Cobequid Bay in Selmah, it was named the New Minas Experimental Base. Just that one little line, I thought, okay, well, there's the name. So I looked up New Minas Experimental Base, and all of a sudden, I had a few hits. And one of those hits is with the US Navy Naval History and Heritage Command. They talked about having a file in their archive that was specifically named the New Minas Experimental Base. So I reached out and asked to see that file, and inside were approximately 12 documents, all related to the New Minas Experimental Base, all phases from the beginning right to the end in 1945. So all the backup that speaks to the existence of that base exists in that file. It outlines in great detail exactly what they're testing in New Minas, and they're testing mines. 1942 is a very interesting year in terms of military history. You have the Americans entering the war on December 7th, 1941, when they're attacked at Pearl Harbor. America's giant machine starts to get to work in 1942. So there's a lot of things going on. That industry starts overnight. Having to start producing all the guns, all of the trucks and jeeps and tanks and planes and equipment that go into warfare, and mobilizing all those people, changing industry from producing one type of product to an entirely new type of product, it is just an amazing transition when you think about it. You know, you see that play out in Selmah. You see the Americans searching for a site that they can build a base basically overnight and test a very important piece of technology that they want to immediately put into the battlefield. They knew they wanted a place to test these that was away from the Naval Ordnance Lab in Washington, somewhere where a separate group of scientists could test the work of the scientists at the Naval Ordnance Lab. They didn't want that direct connection between the technology that was being developed and the testing. They wanted that separation so that there was an honest opinion of the technology. Selmah isn't the very first spot they picked to do this. They had the water, they were able to drop them by parachute, but recovery of the experiment was not 100%. What they discovered was a location that's world-renowned for its tides. Twice a day, the Numinus Basin and Cobequid Bay empty out, leaving this very hard clay surface. So they can drop their experiments by plane, have the parachutes deploy, have it land in a natural way in the water. All of the water disappears, leaving that experiment high and dry on the bottom of the Cobequid Bay. You can drive out using heavy equipment, winch that experiment onto the back of one of those Jeeps, haul it immediately back to an experimental lab to take it apart and see the results of your work. Robert H. Park's letter refers to a number of different marks or models of mines that were tested. Mark 13, the Mark 15, and the Mark 25. You have a group of scientists coming up with ideas and testing ideas of how can we detonate a mine acoustically, how can we detonate it with pressure, how can we detonate it with magnetics. They're just coming up with all kinds of very interesting forward-thinking ideas to try to move that technology forward. Like 1942, 1943, you start to see those Mark 13 and Mark 15 models being used in theater, mostly in the Pacific. And towards the end of the war, you start to see the Mark 25, and that shows up in Operation Starvation. It's one of the mines they predominantly used to surround Japan, and they ended up sinking 1 million or more tons of shipping in that period. Those are all tested at the base in Selmah.
When they opened up the Selmah airport, they got permission to use the runways. Brand new concrete. Now, mind you, it wasn't asphalt, concrete. Beautiful airport.
This is a very special aircraft and a very special pilot too, isn't it?
Yes. Lieutenant Green, Fred Green was his name, and he was about 40-year-old. He was a daredevil. He flew down with the plane from the United States. When he would arrive in the spring, he would have the Bombay loaded with cigarettes and contraband of all kinds, liquor for the guys for the whole 8 months, all in the Bombays. He was a great guy, but he was full of the devil.
What was he flying?
TBF Avenger. It was a torpedo bomber.
Yeah.
And the first heavy aircraft, single-engine aircraft to ever take off from the flat top with a bomb in it.
Right.
And he got commissioned. He'd just take him 5 minutes to come from Divert over to Selmah, land there, and the guys would be waiting there for him, and he'd just turn around, and they'd shut the thing down and hook on, drag it up into the airplane, and close the doors.
Yeah.
And away you go.
Tell me about those experiences. You knew this plane was on the tarmac. You just happened to be there, didn't you?
Well, I happened to get on the truck and go up.
You had no idea what was going on. You just went for the ride, didn't you?
Well, I didn't care what they were doing. I just loved to get in it, and then I'd go up. And he was that type of a guy. He saw me coming. He knew what I was there for. He said, "What do you want?" "Get the hell in here and shut up." And he'd help me climb up and get in the back. And I just sat there. No seats, just a rack where they put stuff. So I remember one time he took me up, and when we were coming in up here, and he did a loop, and I blacked out. I thought we went in a fog. And I said, "That's strange, I don't remember seeing any fog." And I didn't know I blacked out. And he grinned, he had a great big grin when he looked around like that, and I said, "You bugger." He tipped over and let me take a shot of the base, far off so you can't really tell what it is, but I know.
So tell me about these bombing runs, because they weren't all the same, were they? They were
different heights, different speeds, different wind conditions. They tried everything.
Yeah.
They were working toward an end that they wanted, so they had to or erase all the variables
Yeah.
and say, well, this is the one that works the best.
And that leads me to like Cobequid Bay and that great photo that has a great portion of the bay in it. And it has what looks like pyramids floating in the water. But what you've filled me in on later is that those are targets. And there's actually a great photo of you sitting on top of one of those as a young man.
They were made of pontoons, probably 6 of them, and it was a pyramid that floated in the water with a big cable and an anchor. So they had one at low water tide, they had another one 3/4 of a mile up the shore, and one down, and they were in line, parallel with the beach, parallel with the shore. They lined up on those buoys. They had 3 stations, one on the end of the dock, one 1,000 feet down, 1,000 feet up, that did a triangulation on every bomb that dropped.
So when you say station,
A little hut.
Oh, a little hut. So this
Yeah.
is along the side of the.
Right on the edge of the bank.
Okay.
So they just opened up the thing and they had visual of the whole bay.
Gotcha.
On days when the wind was blowing and the waves were rough, they couldn't remember where they dropped naturally. They were all over the place.
Yeah.
But they.
So there's like observers in
Yeah,
those.
exactly. That's what they were. The
Yeah.
observers.
Yeah. So, you know, in this case, Lieutenant Green, these guys all just walked into your life and walked right back out again,
Yeah.
isn't it? What an interesting bunch of characters.
They were great guys. They just were good guys. They were all smart. If you weren't smart enough to stay there, you were gone. And that all happened under my nose, and in hindsight, I just wish I'd have paid so much more attention.
Yeah.
But I didn't. And even when Bob Campbell came back on the visit, it was so short that I regret not having somehow sat down for 2 or 3 hours and related back over the things that happened.
I think Robert Campbell's visit back to see the base is a sad footnote to his career. The fact that there was nothing there to remember that experimental base by. I'm pleased that this project puts to mind again people like Bob Campbell and the other specialists that worked at that experimental base, and reminds people that a lot of work went on, a lot of sacrifice was made. People left their homes, worked in foreign countries, all in the name of freedom.
He said, I gotta go. I gotta come down and see that place. I gotta see it one more time. And he was almost had tears in his eyes, nothing to see. He said, you mean there's nothing here? No, it's gone. He just stood there in amazement and looked, because he expected to see something.
You can get your bearings fairly quickly and start to picture and imagine in all the photos where you are. Being at that well house, which is the only piece that sort of remains on site, you can quickly get oriented as to where the Avenger would have flown over and where the residence and the mess area and and the experimental area, they all would have been. It's just, there's no base anymore. There's just basically trees and grass where that used to be.
Does any of this stuff fit with the base?
No.
No. It's all different.
This is all new when they put the park in. This is one of the remnants that they dropped out in the bay.
Yeah.
It was retrieved because they lost it. No one took it, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And you can see how high it is. I'm 5'8" or 5'7". Gives you an idea how high it is. And it's supposed to, when it's fully loaded with the instruments and the front was loaded with plaster, it's supposed to equal the exact weight of a bomb ready to be armed and set off.
This is hard to read, but it says experimental mine, memorial to the American military activities on this property during World War II. It just makes me wonder why it isn't a bigger thing around here. There's the interpretive board out there that tells us a story about it. But I've talked to a lot of the people in the community while I've been researching around here, and nobody really knows what it was for, what was actually done. That information doesn't exist around. So we're heading up to the only piece really that's remaining on the site that you can point to and say that was part of the base.
Yeah.
And that's the well.
We're coming to it, yeah.
Yeah.
And that was built in 42, I suppose. They took them all winter to drill it.
So all that red brick is original.
That's original brick, yeah.
Just looking at your photo here, I would say I'm just gonna walk, you tell me. I'm gonna walk, I'm thinking right about, based, it looked like it was a little bit inset. So I'm thinking like,
You're very, very close to it.
right about here.
Yeah.
That's the corner of the building where the back end is gonna head over that way. There'll be a door somewhere over there, and it stretches that way.
That's right.
Yeah.
Goes directly toward the water.
Yeah, yeah. And then of course, over here, experimental shed, the workshop. And back here, what did you call that building, that third building?
The garage.
That's the garage.
The repair garage.
Yeah, so when you look at that photo.
Those two were parallel. This one was vertical.
Right.
To the road.
Yeah, you know, you can sort of see the base commander, Bob Campbell, looking at, you know, some of his life's work, and really, that's it.
5 years of his life.
Yeah.
Completely out of context. It's just different.
Right here, what are the memories that come back for you, you know, 1943 to 44?
Standing on the banks and watching the big aircraft come over and drop the bombs, you kept waiting, wondering when he was going to let the bomb go, and you could see it coming through the air. So when they landed in the water, from there, anywhere from there to there, terrific splash, and people would say, there's another one that blew up, there's another one that blew up. But since I worked there, I know that there was never any explosives in the bombs.
Right.
They were for test purposes other than blowing up.
So this is kind of the end of the road for us, because if we go any further, we're going to be in the Cobequid Bay here. But it was good to have this opportunity to walk this area with you and hear your recollections.
I was so excited and elated to just walk the walk and reflect back and think, I wish Bob Campbell was here. I just wish he were here. It didn't seem so important as it does now when I'm thinking back, and I said, what a change in life it made for me, because at 13, when I went to work there, probably just a young kid and getting in the way, but you aged rapidly. And in 4 years' time, I was probably 4 years ahead of my time. They had a very important duty to perform, and I'm sure each one did, unbeknownst to me. It was just a whirlwind of this and that, and guys coming and going, and faces if I just shut my eyes almost, I can see guys walking and faces.
I'm happy for you to learn some things, fill in some blanks. Think of Bob Campbell too, and he gave his service during, you know, his formative years, right? And remembered it for his entire life.
Something struck him radically that he would come all the way back up.
To me, he sort of represents everybody that worked at that base. There is, you know, not a whole lot there telling their story. So I'm glad we're able to do this.
It's a memory that stuck with me all my life. I felt that I was going to go to my grave and nobody would really know. A lot of people knew about it, but they didn't know anything about it. And that was the way they wanted it. So now it'll come to light.